Prophet of Islam, and maybe also we'll discuss some general questions about the prophecy and the messengers of God. So thanks for Brother Sayyid Suleiman, who accepted the invitation of this center and joined the basically program. We missed him last night. Alhamdulillah, we could have the program with Brother Abdul Rahim. So without further delay, inshallah, we want to start the conversation tonight. And as you mentioned before, there's going to be, we start the conversation, but then everyone is welcome to raise hands or just stand up and mention your own questions or comments. Thank you very much, Brother Suleiman, for coming to this program. And we'd like to start the program with a general question. Can you please just briefly have an introduction for us about the topic of tonight, which is about the Prophet, especially the Prophet of Islam, and then if you want to mention maybe a little more general about the mission of the Prophets. Allah subhanahu.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ومولانا أبي القاسم محمد
اللهم صل على محمد وآل
محمد بيته الطيبين الطاهرين الهداة المهديين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين. Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity, inshallah, to engage in these discussions and conversations about important topics in our Islamic belief and practice, and inshallah a way to better understand how it is that we can apply some of the general principles that we've studied and we've learned about Islam in our daily lives. That's one of the greatest goals that we can have in the month of Ramadan. The topic which was introduced for today, I believe, is the Prophet of Islam, and more generally, prophecy, and our relationship with prophecy. And this is something that is a very important topic. I want to bring up a few aspects of this question that I hope will be somewhat different from the way that we normally think about the Prophet of Islam. Many of us, we have this standard picture about Islam, about the Prophet of Islam, that we learned as children, and maybe we learned it in Sunday school or when we were first taught about what makes Islam a great religion. Generally, that story goes something like this. The world was covered in darkness, and it was a time of great ignorance, and no one was more ignorant than the people of the Arabian Peninsula. They used to commit various types of crimes. They used to show no honor or respect to their women. They might bury them alive. They would fight with one another. They wouldn't have any kind of system of justice for the weak or for the vulnerable. And the Prophet of Islam came, and he brought a message that revolutionized, first of all, Arab society, and then humanity as a whole. And that is seen as a fair explanation of what the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad Mustafa sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, meant for humanity. But there's several questions that come from that explanation, and maybe even certain problems that might make it difficult for us to relate to the Prophet fully if we approach the Prophet from this perspective. And this is probably what many Muslims we were introduced to. The most important question that would come is that, well, if the Prophet was so great because he took those things that were backward about society at his time and he reformed them, then what do we do when perhaps the reforms the Prophet brought do not have that revolutionary aspect anymore? To give you an example, in a society where women are treated as property, or where women do not have the right to inheritance, assuming for the sake of argument that that is an accurate description of Arab society before Islam, for the sake of argument. If that is where the starting point is for the Prophet to come and say that women have a choice in who to marry, that women have a share in inheritance, that is a revolutionary step. It might be a very controversial step in that time. And we can certainly say that it is a step forward. But then in our time, we have an expectation of equality. We have certain laws, and we have certain parts of our culture that give different vulnerable groups, it might be women, it might be cultural minorities, it might be religious minorities, they are given protections. And in some cases, those protections may be even more generous than what the Prophet brought to Arabia. My point is that when we approach our relationship to the Prophet at this level, that society was backwards, and the Prophet gave certain rights to the vulnerable. He gave certain respect to the disenfranchised, to the economically underprivileged, to women, to other groups. Then we have an assumption that might make it difficult for us to appreciate that the Prophet's message is relevant for our time as well. That assumption might be one that has an expiration date. And the expiration date, you might say that it was the year 1700 or the year 1800 or the year 1900, but it would be sometime in the past. And so what I want us to be able to think about, what I want us to be able to do as we inshallah move forward in the discussion today, as we think about the teachings of the Prophet in our coming nights, is to examine the Prophet not just in terms of the specific circumstances, the historical circumstances that he came to reform and to engage in Arabia. In fact, we may even want to question whether Arabia was quite as backwards as we sometimes are told. Maybe it wasn't quite so backward. And what we want to do is we want to move towards understanding the Prophet and his mission and his role in our life in a way that is not purely historical. The historical dimension is important. And maybe in some of the questions that we will have today, there will be questions about the seerah of the Prophet and the history of the Prophet. But let's try to examine the Prophet not just in that historical dimension, but in terms of the nature of a relationship between God as the Creator and us as creatures of God. And what it means for that relationship to be mediated in some way in terms of knowledge and ma'rifah through the Prophet. That is something that is not purely historical. It's something that is relevant for us today, as it was relevant for us if we were to look at the time and the contemporaries of the Prophet. Now, what does that mean? Let me just say one thing if I have time, and then inshallah we will move on to our discussion. When we look at why a person would be expected to accept the Prophet, why would a person be expected to accept the Prophet as true in his claims of bringing a message from God? Then what we find is that it's not just a matter of an intellectual argument, where you have a deduction that you made intellectually. It's something that comes from the fitrah. It's something that comes from a search that we have within our disposition that was created and given to us by God. And basically, if you want to boil it down very simply, it is that the message of the Prophet should resonate with your heart and with your soul and with your conscience. And it should resonate at a level that allows you to put trust in the Prophet for those questions that you have doubts about, for those moral issues that you cannot give a conclusive answer based on your own deduction and your own reasoning. And if we understand that that is the basis for our decision, whether to follow a prophet or not, we have to make a similar decision in our own time. Because if we believe, as all Muslims believe, that the fulfillment of Islam's promise will only come through a divinely appointed guide, through somebody who has a connection to an authentic understanding of Islam. Our connection with that divinely appointed guide is also going to have to be on the basis of that same fitrah and that same ability for us to appreciate the profundity and the depth of the message that is being given by somebody who claims to be now the successor of the Prophet. It doesn't matter if you are Sunni or if you are Shi'i. Because if you are Shi'i, yes, you believe that the promised Imam, the Mahdi, he has a genealogy. But we're not going to be able to test that genealogy. And if you are not Sunni and you believe that Allah will send, if you are not Shi'i, if you believe that Allah will send that promised guide at the end of time, then the same standard applies. You have to be able to have some way of connecting and evaluating a claimant. Do I follow this person or do I not follow this person? And it can't just be a superficial type of an understanding. And so I hope that that brings to our minds why this question is very relevant. It's relevant because we have to decide whether to follow the Prophet who came and brought us the Quran and brought us the laws and the teachings of Islam. But it's also relevant because we have to have a way of understanding the role of prophethood and the role of connecting to God through the means of somebody who is protected and guided in their teachings, in their words and in their deeds. And that is something that each and every one of us needs to be ready for. Because when the time comes for us to make a decision about how we are going to carry on the message of the Prophet, part of that is for us to live our lives according to the historical teachings that we have received. Part of that is for us to be ready to accept, and I will say this a little bit incautiously, but the new set of teachings that is going to come when the divine promise for the Mahdi is fulfilled. So there is a very intimate connection. And I hope in our understanding, in our discussion of the Prophet, we will try to gain a better appreciation for that intimate connection between accepting the Prophet as the source and the origin of Islam, and the continuity of that prophetic teaching when it comes not to the origin now, but to the fulfillment and the culmination of the Islamic message.
Thank you very much, brother. We have one topic for Imam Mahdi, so we'd like to discuss it in more details, inshallah, and that specific, basically, comment that you just brought up. But going back to the general comment, so let me ask you a very basic, quick question. So do you think the evidence for our Prophet, the Prophet of Islam, for him being the representative or messenger of God, is it the Quran or is it himself?
The evidence for
The proof or the main
why we
reason.
should follow the Prophet.
So why do we believe that he represents God? That's the question. So is it because of the Quran or it's because of his own?
Well, actually, we can, if we take a look at the Quran itself, the Quran gives us a certain insight into why we should accept the Prophet. And interestingly, the Quran gives us a standard which is accessible to us directly, and not just through the text.
Okay.
And so if we look, for example, at Surah Al-A'raf, verse 157, and I think in the interest of time, I will read the translation and not the entirety of the Arabic verse. But this verse, it talks about the people of the book, Ahlul Kitab. Surah Al-A'raf, which is Surah number 7, and it is verse 157. Why would the people of the book recognize the Prophet? Would they recognize the Prophet because they have some secret text that mentions that his name is Muhammad, his mother's name is Amina, his father's name is Abdullah, is going to be born in this place at this time? Is it something like a detective work? Or is there something else? The Quran says is that the reason why they should accept the Prophet is, first of all, they do find him written about or mentioned in their own scriptures. In the Injil and in the Torah, the Prophet is mentioned. But then the Quran continues, and it doesn't focus on the fact that there is mention of the Prophet in the Injil and in the Torah. It describes certain attributes. It says that he commands what is good, and he forbids what is evil. He permits to them what is tayyib and what is pure, and he forbids them from doing that which is evil. He removes from them the burdens and the yokes that were on their shoulders. So the Prophet is being introduced to the people of the book on the basis of the quality of his message. And in addition to the fact that they have prophecies which exist in their books, that is a means by which the Quran wants us to recognize the Prophet.
So how do we make him different? How is he different from others who might claim that they are prophets, and they might say good things too, but they're not really the prophets, they're just liars? What makes him different?
There's two answers that we're getting from at least this verse. One is that we don't just examine the Prophet on the basis of whether his words sound good. Right? The reason for that is that we have a certain innate ability to tell what is right and what is wrong. But if that is the limit of the standard that we have in order to recognize the Prophet, then we really will not get further from our starting point than we could if we were just to use our own mind in order to determine what is right and what is wrong. If you look at moral questions, the majority of moral questions you and I can answer with our conscience. A majority of our religious obligations, and I'm going to say this, and I hope that there's going to be some questions about it, but let me repeat it. A majority of our religious obligations, you and I can figure out with our minds and with our conscience. Let me say that one more time, because it's a message that I think generally we're not used to hearing, and it should sound, I would imagine, a little bit odd. A majority of our religious obligations, you and I can appreciate without having to go to a prophet, without having to go to revelation, but through our mind and through our heart and through our conscience. There are certain questions, though, that I cannot access directly. There needs to be some other source. And if the only standard that I have for a prophet is whether it sounds good, well, it's not going to take me very far beyond the maybe 50% or 70% of questions that I could have figured out on my own anyway, because I have to have that standard. So the Quran gives us, at least for the people of the book, those who do have a belief and a familiarity with previous scripture, you have the continuity of that scripture. The prophet, he is, quote unquote, in the mold of the previous prophets whom you recognize.
Okay.
Right? And his message completes and agrees with their message. So that works for those people who either are Christians or are Jews, or who might not be people of the book, but they have a close familiarity with the people of the book. Right? That continuity, it connects us to something that we believe in that is beyond what my own mind can understand. In other words, it takes us in a normative direction. It gives us new information. Now, what if we don't have that? What if I'm not convinced about, or I'm coming from a society that's not introduced to the people of the book? In that case, we have the same principle at work. One is, it should agree with our moral sense. And the other is that we need to have some factor beyond just our own fitrah, beyond our own intellect, in order to be able to determine whether this claimant to prophethood is a true claimant or is not. And that will come from, quote-unquote, testing the prophet. That is where the various types of miracles, they will have a role. In my view, that would be a subordinate role. It's not going to be a primary role, but it will have a subordinate role in terms of giving us peace of mind with regard to certain things that we can't figure out just on the basis of our own moral sense or on the basis of our own intellect. It is the job of the prophet and not us to put our heart at rest. But the point is that the heart of the person should be made tranquil and should be put at rest on two bases. One is, the teachings of the prophet should make sense at a deep level. And that will cover a majority of the teachings, but not all of them. A point has to come where we say that, I do not have the means to determine whether this is the right ruling or not. I don't have conclusive answers one way or another. And that is the job of the prophet, to give some means of putting our heart at rest that comes from a miraculous or from a divine source. And it doesn't have to be one thing. It can be a combination. So the Quran can certainly fulfill that role. And it does for some people. But for many of us, we might read the Quran and we might say that it's a beautiful book, no doubt. But it might not be sufficient for me to be convinced that it is miraculous.
Right.
And in that sense, I think the more effective path is for us to study the life of the Prophet, to study the way that he would approach different situations. A good study of the biography of the Prophet, I think, is the best way for a person to say that this human being could not have been but divinely inspired.
Do we fully trust what we know about the life of the Prophet, given that the history of his life was written many years after he passed away, mainly, right?
Can we trust fully the life of the Prophet?
I mean, the information that we have at this time about his life.
That's a very good question. If you look at the history of Western study of Islam, there are a lot of questions that are raised about the life of the Prophet. And sometimes you will hear about a book or an article that says that we don't even know if the Prophet lived in Mecca. We don't know any of the details of his life. The reason for that doubt is often because many of the written sources that we have about the life of the Prophet, they come from at least 100 or up to 115, 200 years after the time of the Prophet himself. But the problem is not as serious as it might seem. In the first place, today, we have a lot of research and a lot of evidence that the Quran, this Quran that we have in our present form, it does go back to the time of the Prophet. We have manuscripts now that have been studied that go back to within 10 or 20 or 30 years of the time of the Prophet.
I think the Quran is less kind of issue because all Muslims kind of have the same version of the Quran at It's almost.
Well, if we're
exactly
trying to
the
understand
same.
whether to accept the
Right.
Prophet,
Right.
we can't take the Quran. So the
Sure.
question, the same question that you ask about the life of the Prophet,
Right.
that question initially comes about the Quran
Right.
itself.
But you want to talk about the Quran, inshallah, tomorrow. So the question for today is, first of all, the Prophet himself. So we have different versions of Muslims, right? We have a number of Muslim identities, and there are things about the Prophet that some identities claim that some others do not agree. So even within
So
the
let's take that
Muslims,
starting point then.
right?
Assuming that we take tomorrow's discussion,
Okay.
right? Keep tomorrow's discussion in mind. And
Yes.
the conclusions that we reach tomorrow, keep those in mind. Right? Assuming for now, for the sake of argument, and we'll talk about it in more detail. Assuming for the sake of argument that we have strong evidence, not just as Muslims, because you and I as Muslims believe it, but objective evidence that the Quran does go back to the time of the Prophet.
Yes.
Take that in mind. If we take that, then the Quran gives us a great deal of contextual clues about the story of the Prophet's life.
Okay.
And so that allows us to then evaluate many of the stories of the Prophet's life and the ahadith. And what we find is that those sources that were written maybe 100 years after the Prophet, in the general principles, there is a great deal of overlap and agreement. So the specific history that is narrated by a Shi'i source, the specific history that is narrated by a Sunni source, the specific history that is only found in one source, maybe non-sectarian, we can ignore that. But the general outlines of the Prophet's character, those are things that we will find are in agreement across the different sources. We will find that they are corroborated by the Quran, and as we will talk about and we will establish, the Quran is at least an objectively contemporary source. And I think that is sufficient for us to gain an understanding of the Prophet. Let me just give one example. Right? All of us have figures in our lives that we trust very deeply. Hopefully we have those figures. If we don't, then that is something that probably goes back to us. But it might be a parent, it might have been a teacher, it might have been a mentor, somebody whose judgment we trust. Now, if we have that kind of trust, how many details of that person's life do we need to know to develop that trust? We don't need to have a detailed and an accurate biography or resume in order to be able to understand a person. Because there is a connection between our soul and that person's soul. We might have had just one or two very formative events in our life where we were able to appreciate that person's grace, that person's sincerity. And then we are able to extrapolate from that that person is a favorable influence in our life. So for the biography of the Prophet, the difficulty we have is that we don't have a great deal of solidly referenced details. But we have plenty of general outlines that are well attested, that historically are not open to question. And we don't need to hold the Prophet to an impossible standard. Just as within our own lives we're able to understand a great deal about a person from limited familiarity and exposure.
Right, I understand.
We can do that with the Prophet as well.
Okay, let's move on to the, I mean, it's a more important maybe question for many of us, which is about the context, basically the time. You know, basically the question is, what are the constants versus the variables that, you know, given the role model of the Prophet and then our time, which is, there are very different things. As you said, like the time of Prophet, there are things that the Prophet did, and at his time, they were considered a very basically revolutionary, exactly. Now, maybe some of the same exact things at our time are labeled as being very basically old-fashioned or very basically non-modern, basically behaviors or traditions or cultures. So the question is, what are the constants versus what are the variables? What are the parts that are basically the eternal, let's say, traditions, or everlasting traditions, versus those that are just basically supposed to introduce a principle but the exact form of the tradition or the exact, basically, action or basically the practice are not supposed to be everlasting. And what do you think are those? How can we distinguish between the two?
How can you distinguish the constants from the variables and what changes? Let me reformulate that question a little bit, because as I said, a big part of our approach to the Prophet is going to be for us to try to understand the limits of our own moral judgment. And if we approach the question from this dimension that, well, what is constant and what is variable, then we have that risk of trying to evaluate each of the teachings of Islam. It might be inheritance, it might be the punishment for crimes, it might be hijab, and we try to evaluate it based on what kind of a response we find within our own heart or within our society. And that's something that can be a very slippery slope. The natural end result of that is that you end up with a religion that kind of expresses the prevailing conventional wisdom within your society. You have a sense of spirituality, a sense of purity, a sense of charity, but it doesn't have any distinguishing features. It might be responsive in the moment, but it doesn't have the momentum or the dynamic as a struggle to move towards the divine or struggle to move towards God. So what is a more constructive approach for us to have? I think the more constructive approach for us to have is to try to understand not what specific teachings are universals and what specific teachings are particular, but to try to gain an understanding of the process that Islam wants us to go through. Right? There are certain questions that actually struck people even in the time of our imams in the first few centuries after Islam as no longer being responsive to society's needs. To give just one example, there was a question about zakat. Right? Zakat, as many of you may have studied, it is considered to be a tax, a charity that is required for Muslims to give on 9 types of property. So you have certain currency, certain livestock, and certain agricultural products. Now,